Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp and I'm the Chief Digital Manager for Dataversity. We'd like to thank you for joining today's Dataversity webinar, Essential Reference and Master Data Management. It is the latest installment in a monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. For questions, we will be collecting them via the Q&A section, or if you like to tweet, we encourage you to share highlights or questions via Twitter using hashtag #DataEd. And if you'd like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. And just to note, the Zoom chat defaults to send to just the panelists, but you may absolutely switch that to network with everyone. And to open the Q&A or the chat panel, you may find those icons in the bottom middle of your screen for those features. And to answer the most commonly asked questions, as always, we will send a follow-up email to all registrants within 2 business days containing links to the slides. And yes, we are recording and will likewise send a link of the recording to this session as well as any additional information requested throughout. Now, let me introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Peter Aiken. Peter is an internationally recognized data management thought leader. Many of you already know him or have seen him at conferences worldwide. He has more than 30 years of experience and has received many awards for his outstanding contributions to the profession. He has written dozens of articles and 11 books. The most recent is Your Data Strategy. And Peter is experienced with more than 500 data management practices in 20 countries and is constantly named as a top data management expert. Some of the most important and largest organizations in the world have sought out his expertise. Peter has spent multi-year immersions with groups as diverse as the U.S. Department of Defense, Deutsche Bank, Nokia, Wells Fargo, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Walmart. And with that, let me turn everything over to Peter to get today's webinar started. Hello and welcome.
Hi, Shannon. Thank you for welcoming me as always, and good afternoon to everybody around the world. I see we have guests from a lot of different parts, and that is just wonderful to speak with you all today. I'm looking forward to the Q&A as we get to the end. So I added a piece of punctuation mark to Shannon's titles, mainly because she's on the West Coast and I'm on the East Coast, and she can't lean over and just punch me. But I thought we'd talk about why reference and master data are essential in that sense of a concept. So let's just take a look at what the program is going to be. We're going to talk about this in the context of data management. And unfortunately, many individuals and organizations are sold that on the idea that reference and master data are your data management strategy. They are a part of it, but as you'll see going into it, that's part of a bigger picture, and that's why it's important to set the context. We'll talk specifically about reference and master data, and if you think about it, reference starts out first because it is the most important, then master data comes next, and then the rest of your data in order of importance on this. And why are they important? Well, because they help you to leverage the rest of what's going on in your organization from a data perspective. We'll look at some very specific building blocks. And for those of you that are new to this series, one of the things I do is overload you with information, because you can always come back and watch this again at dataversity.net, as Shannon said, on here. And so there's a lot of material in here that you're going to be able to come back and reference, and I will talk probably more about some of that material rather than actually reviewing it with you, because some of it's pretty straightforward on that. But it will be important to talk about guiding principles and best practices as we work our way through this. And about an hour from now, I'll turn it back over to Shannon, and she will host our Q&A session to get started. Let's talk a little bit about Maslow. Now, I was interested to watch John Oliver last night, and he referenced Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so I think we can't be too far off here in terms of what we're looking at. For those of you that are not familiar with Abraham Maslow's famous hierarchy of needs, he came to the very reasonable conclusion, and of course, just like many things in hindsight, it looks like common sense, but at the time was, and then still is, considered foundational on this. If we are if we as humans have food, clothing, and shelter needs, we cannot ever be safe. So being physiologically whole and complete is an important prerequisite to being safe. And if we're not safe, then we never have the sense that there's something bigger than us in terms of what we're looking at, love and belonging. And of course, if we're not part of something bigger than ourselves, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between ourselves and the bigger thing. So telling ourselves what we know, knowing yourself, again, an important part. Notice again, we have 4 levels that we have to get to in order to do that. And the 5th level is what Maslow called self-actualization. It's where you're working at your highest potential. And the reason I'm diving off here to a lecture on psychology is because data is quite like this in many ways. What you see happen is that everybody wants you to self-actualize. I simply label them advanced data practices, but nevertheless, they are called all sorts of things. If I were going to redo this title, this slide, in today's world a little bit more, I'd add Bitcoin and blockchain and other fancy flash in the pan kind of stuff. Now, I'm not saying that these are flash in the pan. Almost always when we add things, it's an additive process. Almost nothing ever goes away in our environments, which is an interesting set of the components. But this just represents the tip of the iceberg, of course, in terms of what's going on, and that all of the things that everybody would like to do in self-actualization land are really things that you can do better if you have a good foundation in the first place. And you can see our foundational practices are there to support the rest of this. And they also are below the surface, and most people are unaware of them. In fact, if you notice the top part of this, the golden triangle, is really very technology focused, and that is fine, but a tool in the hands of a fool, of course. You know how to finish that sentence out. The more important thing is for organizations to develop capabilities down here at the bottom half of the chart. And again, it's not even half, it's an ice cube, an iceberg with a vast majority underwater here. These capabilities are critical because if you don't have them, everything at the top takes longer, costs more, delivers less, and presents greater risk to the organizations than if you put in place first your foundational practices on this. Notice these foundational practices also translate very well into the DMM component of this, which is the idea of the data management maturity model. Just another way of describing this from a performance perspective, saying that you have to have some sort of a plan. There has to be a coherent plan to do data. Everybody doing their best with data is definitely the wrong way to do that. That you need a class of professional data management experts to help with that process. And we have developed them now over the last couple of decades, that we understand our organization's data management lifecycle, what's important and not, that we maintain data that is fit for use at the levels that we're expecting it to perform at, and that we use it with the correct architecture and correct supporting processes. Now, the reason I show you this is because it's kind of like the chart on the other page. The data foundation can only be as strong as the weakest link. And in this instance, I'm just going to give you the scale. If you have a pulse, you get 1 point. If you are able to do something repeatedly, you get 2 points. If you write down what it is that you do repeatedly, you get 3 points. If you use some measures around the things that you have written down, then you are awarded 4 points, and you get 5 points if you use that set of knowledge that you've now managed to accumulate and try to, in fact, do something along those lines to make whatever it is you're doing better. And that's where you get the 5 points in here. Now I'm going to assign each of these areas with 3s. When I say each of these, are the top 3, of course, are data management strategy, data quality, and data governance. But now we go down to platform and architecture, and I'm going to give both of them a 1. And why is that the case? Well, your foundation can only be as strong as its weakest link in this instance. So we're going to talk about what we need to do from a platform and a data operations perspective, from a data master data management perspective around this. So these will help this. And the important lesson here, just like it is with Maslow, you can't start at the top and start to self-actualize. You have to work your way up. And the same thing is true in data management here, and data governance, master data management around these topics is a very, very important aspect of it. Most people are not aware of data as a holistic sense. It's like the blind people and the elephant. Somebody up at the top may think it's a lot of data science. Somebody in the engineering part might think it's like an ETL type of an exercise. Somebody in the analysis part of it might be concerned with storage and virtualization topics. Somebody else over here might be concerned with dashboard and visualization. Somebody over here might be concerned with reporting. All of these are valid perspectives on it, but it makes it harder to define what we're talking about in the data world. And we've really had a fairly bad definition up to this point. We've tried to say that data management is what happens between when we source the data and when we use it. And while that's a wonderful thing to say, it doesn't leave people very good understanding about the importance of it or what it is that's happening. So let's take it just a quick bit further in here. Let's talk about sources of data management. It's important, but more important from data management's perspective is the ability to reuse our data. And that is key, because that is not strictly a deliberate function. It's a deliberate and make sure it's accessible when we need it next, and have an anticipation of what that looks like. This is still fairly broad in nature, and so I've got a little bit better definition here around this for you. Again, the sources come in on the left-hand side of this particular diagram, and we tend to lump these into a data engineering category. I'm not going to go through each of them here to talk about it, but it does speak to the necessity of specialized data skills that occur, and an exploitation side on this side with data science, delivery, presentation, storytelling, et cetera, all being components of it that get us to the use of the data. But remember what I said on the previous slide, we need to really build out this reuse component in here, because if we don't, we are, again, not able to do it as faster, better, and cheaper as we would like to do it in these areas. Our focus today on master data management has a lot to do with then preparation and delivery of this data in this context here. I'll show you this in another version in just a couple of minutes here, but let's go on to the next part, which is what is reference and master data management. If you're seeing this for the first time, it's absolutely my fault. And the reason I say that is because as president of DAMA International, we've tried really hard to get this diagram out in the rest of the world. It's our articulation of the world of data management in here. And I've put a yellow triangle sort of thing around reference and master data management to indicate that it is one of the 11 pie wedges that we have on this that we consider fundamental to our body of knowledge. In context here, you can see the other parts: quality, architecture, modeling, governance as a central piece. All of these are critical in order to do this, but it's generally not a good idea to try all of them at once. Each of these practice areas has their own different approach, different set of skills, different set of technologies around this. We are, as I said, focusing on reference and master data. Let's dive in a little further. A definition that pops to mind when you pops to Google when you go out is planning, implementation, and control activities to ensure consistency with a golden version of context data values. I mentioned the John Oliver sketch last night. He was talking about being able to find data on certain types of people and things like that by de-anonymizing data, which is not a hard one. But if you've got a golden version of it and you have multiple parts in your organization that maintain data about the same subject, you kind of like wearing two watches. You know, which one is the right one? Well, people will eventually know inside that there is a golden one. The data that Peter has is better than the data that Shannon has, if we're going to, you know, put names on it or something like that, which again, we don't really want to do on this. The golden version is critical. By the way, if you are outside of the data area as well, they think that MDM is mobile device management. So just recall that when you're in a crowd of IT people, it could be one or the other when you hear it come up. Most importantly, though, the idea is, and Gartner says it very well in this instance, MDM is not a thing, it's a discipline or a strategy where we're trying to make sure that we can have the information that the organization shares be more accessible and able to deliver business data when a business process needs it. It's, however, sold most of the time as a technology solution, and it is a good place in many instances to begin. But I've seen and unfortunately helped organizations out of the holes they've dug for themselves by spending tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on these kinds of initiatives. And then I will be walking the halls, you know, after it's been running for a year and a half, and I'll hear somebody say, I couldn't figure out where to put the data, so I stuck it in the MDM. It seemed like a good spot. Now, when somebody says that to you, you've lost, because you've lost all the discipline that needs to happen around that. Notice again, that's the definition that Gartner likes to use. So while it's sold as a thing that you buy and you're done, it's not. You need some technology, but you are not done when you just buy the technology. In fact, one of the harder definitional parts around master data management is defining what is master and what is not. So here's a good place to start. It's the nouns that you work with: the parties, the places, the things. We would call them persons if we weren't doing data modeling, as some of these articulates are. The idea is, what are the general people that we do business with? Should we have transparency and insight into our you know, sets of customers, into where we do geographic location? I did work for the Army on and off over the years, and one of the more interesting challenges we've had is that the Army's has multiple ways of identifying location information. So you have to actually pass along a set of location information and the key to unlock them, so that you know whether you're using metric or gosh, what's the other one? Metric or English, I guess, units. I think there's another word for it as well. We won't dive into that. Anyway, let's go on. reference data management. Let's start with the most leverageable. It's the idea that you're going to control domain values, as in vocabularies, over different identifiers. The idea is we'll have the same ones that we'll use every place in the organization so that we don't end up with lots and lots of multiple versions of the same instance. It means we'll be able to consistently and timely classify data when it comes in and know where to put it. Organizations get excited about this because I start to talk to them about developing a taxonomy, perhaps, as a byproduct of this exercise in reference data. For example, if you had a group that couldn't tell the difference between its current customers and its potential customers, I'm sure none of you on this call have ever purchased something and then immediately been told the next day by the same vendor that it's on sale. It happens over and over and over again because many companies have trouble differentiating current customers from their potential customers. We'd obviously like to tell the potential customers to come buy from us because our prices are low, but we don't want our current customers to expect currently low prices all the time. And organizations get excited about this and they start to go, wow, that's kind of neat. I love the concept. How does that work out? And you say, well, we're going to start this process, but the reason we're writing it down is because you have concepts that you haven't thought about where they should go. And they say, oh, what would that be? Well, you say, well, what about the concept of an X customer? Is it a current customer that you want to work and somehow mark differently? Or is it a potential customer, in which case you don't want to pretend that you have not had any contact with them at all on this? Again, different answers, no one right answer, but you can see how it gets into this. And organizations get excited because you can then take your current customer and say, what about residential versus commercial customers? These are good. Okay, so I can further differentiate, segment my customers internally here. And your marketing people probably have ideas on how this works, and they may have actually even implemented it in the data pieces. If they're working well together, that's wonderful. Many organizations, though, go bust when they say, well, what about the concept of a VIP customer? Where does that fit into this process? And again, this is mainly to spark the discussion so that the groups can agree on these terms used throughout the entire organization around this. So when we talk about reference data, it's used to classify and categorize these things. For example, order status may have 4 things. It's new, it's in progress, it's closed, or it's canceled. Those are the only things an order can be. Again, that may or may not work for your organization. We have in the United States 2-letter zip codes abbreviated for every state. Mine particularly is VA, Virginia. So when we have these reference data sets, we can now look and see what these are. Now, some of these are actually international standards, which is wonderful. Again, many people, though, will be, as they're coding things, as they're working with them, as they're knowledge workers, so they're all working with data, they will encode information in there. And they'll say, well, it's from the United Kingdom, so the abbreviation for that must be UK. Of course, you can see that it is not. And if you then go to try to market to all your customers in the United Kingdom and find that you have thousands or perhaps even millions less than you planned on, that can throw a monkey wrench into your business problems. By the way, with reference and master data, the key to keeping this focused is to make sure that you focus on specific things of business value in your organizations. So if you have a story that said, remember the time we wanted to try and run this promotion in London and we only reached half the customers that we want? Yes, people will probably understand that. And if the reason for that was because people had the reference data coded incorrectly, then that's a really good story to remind them that, yeah, that was bad and we don't want to do it again. So we've talked for 2 slides on reference data. Let's flip over now and look at master data. This is, again, data that provides the context for the transactions. So somebody goes out and buys a sandwich. What is the context for that? Well, you can see there's many. There's the customer's context. There's the store owner's context. Maybe if we're tracking the recycling on it, there's a recycling context given that, again, could be transport to other things. All sorts of things happen there. These business rules allow us, again, to find the parties, the locations, whatever it is that we're trying to do with the context for these transactions. It comes from the term master file. And the way master file works is that we had this old way of doing transaction processing systems, which isn't too awfully updated in today's environment when you look at what happens. But we had a balance, for example, that maybe my checking account balance today of $100, and I go to lunch and spend $5 for a sandwich. Well, that night, an update program would take the original balance, apply all the transactions to it, and come up with a new version of the master file, my balance now being $95 or $5 less than it would have been in the old days. That master file, we only want one place in the organization where that $95 rests. If we have too many more places than that, we run the risk of going back to $100 and allowing Peter to take too much money out of the bank because of the lack of controls in that context. So let's talk about reference versus master here. And it's a kind of pretty straightforward example. These are the Social Security gender codes that were required by law of the Canadian Social Security system at one point in time years back. Also at that time, the FBI used them as well in there. So there's 9 gender codes. Some people would say today there are more than 70 based on Facebook categories and things like that. No problem with it. Of course, the question of managing it becomes important. If we're going to let people, and you probably saw at least if you're US based, you probably saw that the US is now allowing people to, we used to require them to put M or F on their passports. We're now allowing them to put X on there as well. Some people are having trouble with that. That is a reference data decision. Right? It's the very tip of the iceberg in there. The fact that we maintain these specific 9 gender codes is our reference data for the 2 domains that I described to you here. Master data, then, given that as a context, would allow us to say that the golden source of gender about my customer, Pat, is whatever it happens to be, given that. Both of these provide context for the transaction data that goes on around this. Now, when you look at what's happening in this space, there are many things that data does where we take a set of these things like these 9 gender codes here or any number of other types of topics. If these aren't built into the system in the first place, somebody will look at you across a table, over a telephone, replying to an email and say, I'm sorry, the system can't do that. What they're oftentimes referring to is the fact that that certain types of codes are simply not allowed because they weren't architected in the systems in the first place. So why are these important? Well, hopefully you're seeing the amount of leverage that we're getting here, but let's just go ahead and make it very explicit. In general, many people will articulate that there are 3 types of data: reference data, and they may do things like, what countries do we do business? Now, again, if your system has 2 country codes that you can do business in, the United States and the United Kingdom, and somebody wants to do business in the Netherlands, they can't do it. It is unavailable to them, or they're going to have to do something, quote, data illegal in the system, creating some data friction in the process. They might say, what types of accounts do we allow in this case to have, or otherwise control specific vocabulary items that we're looking for. And I've put a tiny little dot in the upper right-hand corner there just to show you that that's the amount of data that we really have in reference data land. Although I was talking to a group earlier today where they had a specific transaction that could occupy 2,000 rows, 2 million rows of data with 18 columns on each. So that's a heck of a data structure right there. But that literally could be reference data. And that reference data controls the allowable values in the master data. So when I show up at one of the airplane lounges and present my card, they generally say, you're not a member of our club, so you can't come in, unless I have some other excuse in order to do that. Again, giving us common data structures. It's, am I a member of this list? Am I on this list? Et cetera, et cetera. Both of these, the reference controls the master. The master, of course, controls the transactions. And the transactions are just the instances of the values. Again, $5 for the sandwich. My transaction is authorized. Even when I do a like, there's some great stories out there on the internet about how Facebook in its early instance was running on a SQL Server platform. And every time somebody likes, of course, it represents a database access and update, and it was killing the company. They really did some engineering to get themselves out of it. And that's another story that remains to be told at some point in the future. Again, they had not implemented this kind of a structure in that context. And so better planning would have been more helpful around this. Now we're going to turn our attention here to just a brief little bit around a strategy, because I used the word earlier to say that master data management is more of a strategy than it is a thing. And it's most important to think of it as more of a strategy than a thing. So our use of the word strategy, interestingly enough, took off around 1950 when the business literature folks discovered the use of the word from the military. The business literature folks like this concept of a grand plan or 100 PowerPoint slides or a 100-page document for your strategy, because of course they get paid by the pound to write these things, and they tend to become unactionable. This leave strategy in the business world as something largely of a thing. Whereas if we go back to the original military context for it, the best definition that I like to use is a pattern in a stream of decisions. And that changes the strategy from a thing to much more of a process, something, again, that you should implement as a program working through aspects of eliminating your data debt or whatever it is you're bringing the master data management solutions in order to get started. I'm going to give you an unfortunate history here, and there will be some negative examples as well as some good ones. Here's a company that started out in year one by just buying an MDM solution because they went to a webinar and somebody said, hey, MDM says that's where you start, so let's go buy an MDM, right? Well, with very little analysis, work, or thought around this, they implemented some technology, giving them the proverbial one-legged stool. There was confusion as to the value of the system. The users did not have confidence or know how to use the MDM. Again, if people can't understand what the purpose of the master data management solution is, there's very little likelihood they'll understand the rest of it. And most importantly, as we're looking at these from the outside perspective, most organizations and the knowledge workers in them don't have the sophistication, nor necessarily should they, to understand the difference between the MDM and the data in the MDM. Again, a simple example is Salesforce. Many organizations use Salesforce as kind of an MDM type of solution, although it's really more of a CRM solution than an MDM solution. There are differences between the two. Given that, and if you take Salesforce.com, which is fine software, and fill it up with bad data, most users don't know enough to tell the difference. They simply say, Salesforce isn't working well for me on this. I wonder how we can make it better. Anyway, getting general agreement, they did a post hoc after the end of the first year and said, what went wrong? We didn't do it right. Let's restart the effort. Okay, what went wrong? Well, probably we look around and say, yep, bad quality data. Big hint to all of you on the webinar today. Your organization can almost always claim that poor quality data. Although a safer way to go, rather than saying it's of poor quality, is to say that it's of unknown quality, because that presents even more mystery to the management that says, yes, we want to fix it in there. Again, also there was some inadequate training around the MDM components in this little scenario that I'm describing to you. So the response was to get some data quality technology, again, buying something instead of actually looking at the processes. Now we're adding some immature but maturing data practices. We're giving them a tool focus and have this tool. So now I've got 1.5 legs on my stool, but still not nearly enough in order to know what we're doing, because of course we all understand the phrase garbage in, garbage out. And that phrase means that we've got to make sure that we've had both the data and the awesome thing. So in this case, the awesome thing is going to be our master data management solution, plus some good data will give us some good results in order to do that. So here we are back to our DMBOK again. And the consultant says something like our methodology, right? Really fun words. Actually, if you look it up, the word methodology really means the study of methods. So most consultants would get that particular question wrong on an exam in this. But really a better way to say it is this is a realistic way of looking at practicing MDM. And that's really where you should approach it from, is practicing, because it's a discipline. You're not going to be great the first time that you do it, but you're going to do something and you're going to get better at it. So that three-legged stool that I've talked about. So where I like to get organizations to think about is to say, you probably don't want to hit the entire DMBOK wheel at once, but if you pick 3 areas, it might be a really good way of starting. So for example, reference and master data may be a good place to start. I would not necessarily start off with buying a solution. You have somebody in your organization who is perfectly capable of coding up a reference and master data management type of database in here. Not that it's going to be your production system for going this way, but it's going to be your learning system so that you will now start to play with these ideas and exercise them in there. You may also then similarly being informed, look at an initiative around data quality and finally realize that governance is what binds the two together. Governance, of course, being involved in most every aspect of what we do in the data areas. Now, again, this is one example of how this could work out in your organization, but it tends to be a repetitive one because you'll notice these are interdependent aspects. Data governance makes the case for and is responsible for implementing quality data. That data quality then is a necessary but insufficient prerequisite to the success of any master or reference data management initiative. And these capabilities constrain, the lack of MDM capabilities constrain the governance effectiveness areas. So maybe the first iteration around this is that we look at quality, governance, and reference and master data. Notice I'm giving one time unit of X with each of these. Maybe it's a year in your organization. I've got several organizations who are working through these things, and multi-year evaluations is entirely reasonable. They also may be a month-long exercise depending on your resources. But you accomplish something that's a combination of these three things that tangibly delivers value while at the same time improving the access to the golden sources that your users really need to have. A second iteration on this might then look like this. We are still in our reference and master data, but now we've looked and said, wow, well, we learned something from data quality, and that is that there's this other thing that goes on called metadata, and we need to look at that as well. So now we get 1x point for metadata, but now we've done governance and reference and master data twice, so we've got 2 experience points in each of those areas. Again, our third iteration here might be, again, reference and master data. So we're actually getting kind of good at this, but now we need to back up and look at some data architecture components around this. This is why the idea of approaching this from a practice perspective and getting the practice better is so much more important than selection of the specific technologies. And again, I urge all of you to try to build these on your own and grow your own type of thing, learning over a series of time that you will eventually be able to incorporate this into your existing infrastructure, these capabilities, or better still, perhaps, into better conversations with the vendors and the vendor community around this. I mentioned vocabulary a couple of times. Here's just a quick example of how important reference and master data can be to an organization. This was an organization that was going to purchase an ERP, an enterprise resource planning program. Think SAP, Oracle, JD Edwards, et cetera, around that. And the only thing that they noticed was that the ERP had business rules built all throughout the software that said that any time that fuel is transferred from one tank to another tank, it counts as a retail sale. Well, certainly these 3 tank transfers represented retail sales. However, these did not. And that was a problem for the organization. And they needed to be able to either modify the ERP, and I say modify, the word actually is customize, and that's probably not something that many of your organizations are going to invest in today's environment around this. But in addition to that, they also were going to have to remodify the software every time the vendor released a new update of that software. Now, if you've seen how many updates come out for your apps on your mobile devices, you know that that process can become a little bit fraught with risk around that. So the organization instead decided to, from a reference and master data perspective, simply adopt a controlled vocabulary. And nobody in the organization is allowed to use the word tank without the word qualifier in front of it. So it's a tank on wheels, or it's a tank that flies, or it's a tank that's on a boat, or it's a tank into which we put retail products. This allows them to avoid the process of having to customize their ERP, but still implement in a non-technical way a reference and master data management solution given this. Of course, given that they also have other types of tanks perhaps that they worry about, it's even more important to talk about the process of being reasonable around this. There are sources of reference and master data in our organizations, and that's because we grew up in IT paving the cow paths. That means that the payroll area had its own application, the research and development area, the marketing, the finance, the personnel, the manufacturing, you name it, and everything worked really well as long as the data never left those individual data silos. But of course, we get questions all the time of, can I get this data from here to here to here in order to use these types of technologies? And now the question of which one is the master golden source, and how do I make sure that it's accessible to everybody else with the cadence, with the business practice, the process architecture that we need to have in order to produce that. So it's a picture of difficulties here. Here are a couple of pictures out of the dim box. I apologize for the poor graphics here on this, but it makes sense. We've got business data stewards, and they're going to manage their codes in the reference. These are the list of codes that we're allowing to have, whether it is 2 for M or F, or whether it's 9 for the Canadian Social Security system, or whether it's 72 that make up the Facebook genre in this. This allows us to update the database of record, that golden source, and that controlled update then can be propagated to other systems depending on what we're attempting to do, and eventually works its way through the entire set of systems. Reference data, as you might guess, should be changed as little as possible, because when you make a change, it potentially affects so many other things that are going on in that area. Of course, then we get externally sourced data that we're trying to add to that environment. It becomes a very big challenge around this. Again, reference, remember, is the very tip of the iceberg, which we're looking at. Similarly, master data is going to have a very similar process. And in fact, many of the times they are looked at a parallel architecture, which gives everybody the ability to work in a common platform around this. However, I've told you a little bit of the technology. The other important aspect on this is understanding what your organization is doing from a process architecture perspective. So before we dive into that area a little bit, I want to just differentiate here between sort of task and process orientation. In the industrial age, we grew up with tasks that might number 12, where we're trying to get something done. Again, whatever the thing is that we've put in place. Unfortunately, this mindset gave us the idea that people are stupid and that we should break the work down into its simplest and most elementary tasks, because people can also be replaced, and therefore there would never be a challenge around that. Instead, when we come back and look at this process over the years, what has evolved, we find out that of these 12 tasks, some smaller subset has only value-added activities. The other tasks were simply tasks that were done because we always used to do it that way, and we really didn't want to learn how to do anything else. So reuniting those tasks into a more coherent business process needs to be part of the process. And the best technology pieces that you can bring into this is this discipline of master data management. Now, how do you find out what your existing business practices are? Well, you can sit down, and if your organization, I find that 1 in 10 do maintain some aspects of process architecture in their operations, but most obviously do not. And there are some great things that are going on where you can now drop in, for example, artifacts such as log files, and that the software as a service systems will now spit back out to you some ideas as to what the process flows might be, in fact, with specific measures around them. The reason that's so important is because it gets us very, very quickly to a process architecture of the area that we're doing the focus on. Most organizations are going to need 7 plus or minus 2 major processes that they deal with from an organizational perspective. And that challenge of doing that architecture work has been daunting for organizations, but I can tell you for sure that if you don't get the process architecture right, you will not get the master data management portion of this right. Let me give you a very specific example. It has to do with car engines. Now, the traditional car engine is a gasoline engine. Again, it's getting more towards electric now, but we're still a gasoline society. And we tried as a society for many different years to replace this engine with something else. Turned out that was the wrong approach. And the reason it was the wrong approach was the wonderful example of the, I almost said Ford Prius, the Toyota Prius. I haven't bought a Ford in years, but I buy my Toyotas on here. So here's the diagram for my particular '05 Prius. Notice it has two engines, an electric engine and a gasoline engine under the hood. And it also, of course, has a very large battery component. And when you see these things working, you'll see the insight that the Toyota engineers needed to have from a process delivery perspective, which is that it wasn't an either or situation of having either an electric engine or a gasoline engine, but in fact, the best way to do this was both. Now, I am not driving. This is not me driving. It's a video I downloaded off of YouTube here, but what you're seeing is the battery is in use. It's powering the electric motor. Now we're slowing down and the wheels are powering the electric motor back up. So you can see which direction. Now this is one of those things, that's why they call us Prius drivers, because in the beginning, people had a tendency to watch this instead of the road, which is a really bad idea. So as I said, I'm not filming, we're not driving anywhere, but you can see what's happening with this is the idea that instead of either a gas engine or an electric engine, this solution gave us enough of a time so that the last 20 years we've had the ability to use these hybrid cars to bridge us to the actual electric cars. Now I have to figure out is who's going to be responsible when the electric car gets in trouble and self-driving cars hit a pedestrian or something like that. That liability stuff, we ain't solved that stuff yet. By the way, architecture's very complex. So don't try to overthink this process. It is not absolutely critical in order to do this, but it is critical that you make sure that your process architecture is understood enough so that you can implement your master data management solution with respect to a way that will complement that architecture instead of breaking it, which is what many times happens in this. So that's why reference and master data are so important. We've got some building blocks here to go through, just again, to give an idea of goals and principles, make it simple. Authoritative use of where we get the right type of data. It's going to lower the cost and it's going to lower the complexity in our organizations, as you can see from those slides I showed you a couple back, and support better BI and analytics types of efforts as a result of that. There are a whole series of activities that we go through here. And this is mainly a checklist for you to give you an idea of what you're looking for here, but it does give you a good set of ideas. You can do all of this without talking to the vendors, just internally in your organization, identify these hierarchies, things. All of this planning is wonderful. And when you do this kind of planning, you will have a better conversation with the people who are trying to sell you these MDM solutions. Remember, I'm an advocate that says don't buy one just first, build your first one, try that out, see how it works. You'll learn much more about the process. There's some very specific information that you'll need to be able to go after here. Again, let's find out on very specific, who needs what information, what data is available, how does this data differ from other sources, why do the other sources even exist. It's not to say that data that is duplicated is bad, although what we prefer to say is data that is replicated. Replicated sounds like a conscious effort, and hopefully it's noted somewhere that there are 2 copies of this particular data set out there. But duplicated just means I've hit Control-D on my computer and made a duplicate of the files and put them on a notebook somewhere and gone off and done my own thing with them. Bad thoughts in general around that. Of course, we have existing processes for how inconsistencies can be reconciled. I had a funny one at the university here where we put in one of our first master data management solutions, and the library had some people that were still giving, if a student walked in and wanted to borrow a book, they would give them a new V number. Now, V numbers are what we have our unique student and faculty IDs at the university. And of course, giving a student a new V number is generally not a good idea, because that is literally their key number, their master record. And so we would not know whose grades to post to that particular share if they had multiple ones. So we had to be very specific about that and say, look, I know that you're enjoying making $200 an hour reconciling this, but we'd rather have you fix the problem than instead just keep solving the individual solutions around that process. And finally, the process of sharing. If organizations need access to this data, you can't have a 30-day refresh cycle There's no way that somebody will stand for that kind of delay, and that, again, you have to complement the existing organizational practices that are there. There are going to be a number of deliverables that you'll have in order to produce this. Again, cleansing can come here. Cleansing sometimes is a separate data initiative, no problem either way. You're going to have those set of requirements that you're attempting to do. Make certain they are written down in very clear and concise fashion and posted so that everybody can weigh in on them and hopefully type to improve them. Eventually, of course, you'll need data models of what's going on, reliable reference and master data, providing this golden record lineage. And finally, keep track of those measures and metrics. If you remember, about 40 minutes ago, I was telling you about the maturity of data management practices. That has all to do with having a repeatable process, writing down that repeatable process, and then measuring things that occur as you are completing the steps required of that completable process in there. Finally, we've got a lot of different roles and responsibilities that we want to have around this. From the human perspective, there will be suppliers of data, there will be consumers of data, there will be participants in the data governance process as we go through it. Again, use these as a checklist. Do I have enough? Have I categorized people right? What are the representations that I need to have in order to do this? I'm going to spend a bit longer on the technology piece here, with the idea that, yes, you can. First of all, most organizations have some aspects of ETL already in existence. ETL stands for extract, transform, and load. It's the idea of transforming data from our transactional systems to our analytical systems that will be better able to analyze it. The transactional data is kept for an optimization focus. The analytical perspective is kept for an analysis focus. And the metadata that is in these extract, transform, and load tools is tremendously valuable. There are lots and lots of reference and master data management applications. No problem with it. But as I said before, I would not buy these right away. Instead, I would start out and use them, build it yourself. You're not building anything terribly sophisticated. What you're really doing is practicing your process architecture. You will, of course, need some data modeling and process modeling tools. These are freeware that you can download off the internet. You will need to have some sort of a place to put your reference and master data definitions, and eventually your reference and master data. As you start to do this, as you load the repositories, you will need some sort of ability to profile the data that's in there, so that you not put in data that's always of high quality. Of course, everybody would aspire to that, but start out rather low and just say, let's change the amount of data that is unknown from a greater number to a lesser number. And we'll try to get there, because there will be some aspects that you'll be able to do with cleansing, but some aspects you will also have to restructure in order to do this, focusing on the integration aspects. Many organizations find rule engines very, very useful in this. And of course, the entire process needs to be bound together with a set of change management technologies and practices. I mentioned before, again, the fool with the tool is still a fool. So many organizations start out by buying the technology without knowing how to use it, without knowing how to have a conversation with the vendor, and instead not coming up with a good solution for the organization. Let's just look at an example that we did for one group. This was a bank that was reaching back out to a customer base that perhaps had been ignored. And they have 8 systems of record is what the SOR stands for on their golden sources that they had. And the goal was, when they put this together, they were able to tap into a little lightweight service that they put on top of it that was just saying, I can look and see when we last touched the people who were in these various systems of record. And ideally, you'd like to have one, but they had this particular challenge. They created a small repository for the extracts that was then popped into their various distribution channels. And the distribution channel would look at a contact and make a decision based on the latency index, whether they could persuade the customer to come in. Oh, let's just say come inside for a toaster, in order to do that. So they could update the address, get that information back into this, and then looking at what was coming in from the external world. So you can see this was quite integral to their solution in order to do this. Here's another specific example here. And the master data pieces in the right corner here are integrated completely with the knowledge management and the data quality master data catalog efforts. And you can see, of course, it's just seriously a major component of how these things work. Finally, one more example here just to see the integration. This is a set here that's looking specifically at the monitoring and management practices from a quality perspective in order to do this. So again, lots of good results can be obtained from this process, but it is not an easy one. Again, let's talk about what we need to look at from a guiding principles and best practices perspective. And first of all, the idea that most organizations are just failing at these things because they're going in too fast, buying the technology way too quickly in here. And when we analyze these failures, 30% of them are generally regarded as failures. Many of them are too complex and ineffective leadership, implemented as a technology or implemented as a project, which means, by the way, a project has a beginning and an end. So I don't know when you would ever stop doing master or reference data management in here in order to do that. Again, making it separate from the data quality and governance initiatives or trying to implement it with less than robust technology. All are going to be problematic given to that. So there's a bunch of success factors in here. Again, I won't go through each of them here. We can just briefly say that the better support that you have, the better set of expectations, the more practice that you can have before you make a major investment is the way to do this. Now, just imagine instead of going back to management, remember your CIOs and others in leadership places are always being asked to do more with less. And if you go ask for a $10 million initiative around master data, you better have more than $10 million value that you can be able to deliver. And while it all works perfectly on PowerPoint and from the consultant's perspective, I think that your own results that you get internally speak much more to that process themselves. So doing a little bit of master data management yourself for a year or so before you decide to have a conversation with the vendors has always proven to be a valuable effort. Again, the idea is, do you have active sponsorship? Do you have this integrated with your governance? Do you have good organizational change management? Are you using people, process, and technology strengths in order to do this? Each of these are going to be very, very critical for your process. And resist, of course, the idea to customize the process because organization, just a little bit, and once again, you have to get into this process of updating it every time the app updates, and that's going to be a deleterious process for the organization. So let's complete this section here with the idea that the guiding principles around this should be to provide shared reference and master data to the organization. And let's get one thing straight. The data belongs to the organization. I don't let anybody in my sphere own data. They are stewards of the data, but the data belongs to the organization as a whole, and that they're going to share this data at a higher quality through this better distribution process. If you're putting in a bureaucracy to manage data, which is what this ultimately involves in some sense, it had better be able to provide more value than it costs in order to do this. This reference and master data initiative is an ongoing effort. You can achieve a lot by moving data into it that is only of known quality, but most organizations just forklift their data right in. So having the idea that we put it in and we installed it and we're done and therefore we don't have to do anything else is the surest way to make your MDM initiative fail. Business data stewards have to be empowered to determine where and what the quality is required to be golden in order to do this. I tell them that they are alchemists. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, we actually give them medals and call them Commonwealth data stewards in order to do this. The golden values, again, have to represent these best sources. If you supply the wrong quality data or the wrong version of it, it's an issue in this. And that you want to replicate this, as I said before, only from these golden sources, that you don't really want to have uncontrolled duplication going on, and that these reference data changes will require formal data management in here. Now I'm going to get close to the end here with just one more little wonderful articulation here. This is from our colleague Dave Evans at British Telecom, and I just want to set the site for you here. British Telecom had a mess pretty much like every organization, and they wanted to start a master data management initiative. But they also wanted to articulate that process to their knowledge worker community. And they spent some money and articulated a little less than 1 minute video that describes what they were intending to do and how they were going to go about it. Take a look here, and then let's come back and chit. Now, data is not a process that most people like to talk about outside of the data community. Generally not your best conversation starter, probably not a great pickup line around that. And here's a little 45-second video that they measured the effectiveness of with it. They could tell how many of the employees not only opened this little email and watched that little video, but more importantly, how many of them watched it multiple times as they were learning from the process. That everybody would agree that the data was a bit messy at first, and processes were duplicated, and sorting the data makes sense. That's a very simple, compelling message. And I think one of the better articulations of how to actually describe what you're attempting to do with respect to your metadata. Dave said you could use this. It is on my website if you need to download a copy of it or whatever. It's actually out there on YouTube. But again, we certainly thank him for his initiatives around that. So as we wind our way towards the Q&A section, we're getting towards it. We've had a little bit of an hour's journey here where we talked a little bit about data management as a discipline, specifically looked at reference and master data management as the two most important linchpins, the leverage aspects of our whole data journey that we're talking about in this. The idea that if we can get the reference and master data right, a lot more things will go correct in our organization because precisely of that leverage that exists there. There are lots and lots of building blocks to get started. Do not start out, however, by going and talking to the vendors and buying 6 or 7 figures worth of technology first. Instead, put your own requirements together from the materials that I've provided to you here and start practicing reference and master data management as you do this, because it is much more powerful when you learn and the organization builds up its organizational muscle around this in order to do this. So as we approach our Q&As, again, just a couple quick things. This is a process model of master data management process. So it's an IPO description of this. And I'm just going to go through this as we wind our way through the last couple minutes. Again, definition of master and reference data management: planning, implementation, and control activities, ensuring consistency with a golden version of contextual data values. We are focusing on trying to get the leveraging of data part correct in order to do this. That the goals are to provide an authoritative source of reconciled information through lower cost, and again, support those BI efforts and analytic efforts that we talked about as well. That there will be different types of input. Drivers from business have to be considered because that's the only place people will recognize value coming out of this. This will give us the data requirements. Of course, there will be some policy and regulations depending on what industry that you're in. Also, there will be available standards, code sets, master data, and transactional data that will go into this. Again, you don't have to manage all of your master data correctly the first time around. Just take a slice. I had a hospital start out with a list of the doctors admitted to practice in the organization. That turned out to be a wonderful learning experience for them, where they were able to mature in that aspect. The suppliers of this master data are going to be all scattered throughout your business, but you're looking specifically at what types of things are guiding the business pieces. What do the data stewards have in their expertise? What types of consumers do we have? Again, lots and lots of components. And again, the different set of job classifications. Just to give you an idea of how difficult this is, we're still having ongoing conversations with the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, who doesn't recognize any of these categories in here. So we can't measure the number of people that are performing in this. That there's some very specific activities, and they tend to confine themselves to these 10 that we look at specifically. Again, notice there's a designated as planning, control, development, and operational in nature. The last two are the operational in terms of focusing on it. That there are deliverables. Again, they start with the requirements, so don't let anybody start you with the technology. Again, models, cleansing metrics, et cetera, looking for specific consumers and what measures they care about. And finally, a set of technologies that you can put in place in order to do all of these. I've left you with a couple of references around this. These are fairly good, being able to take a look at each of these things. And of course, we've got some upcoming programs, including in the next couple of weeks, Enterprise Data World Digital online that we're looking forward to talking to you all. And then we're getting ready for the DGIQ conference in San Diego in June. So Shannon, I think I'm right on top of the hour. Did I get it right? Yes, I did. All right.
As always, it's kind of magic how you do that. It's awesome. And just to answer the most commonly asked questions, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email by end of day Thursday for this webinar with links to the slides and links to the recording, along with anything else requested throughout. Diving in here into the Q&A section, I don't know if we've been asked this before, Peter, the data management pie chart. How long did it take DAMA to create this chart? And it's the second reiteration, right?
Okay, well, yes, this is the second version. Let me just put to it. And it's a great place for me to acknowledge the wonderful volunteers. DAMA is 100% volunteer organization, and this came out of the dedication of a number of very dedicated individuals to do this. The first version came out in 2009, the second version in 2017 in order to do this. And I can take a little bit of pride to say that the federal government is kind of acknowledging this is the best practices standard that helps support their FIPA law, which is a piece. So thanks for asking about it. Again, it's an interesting thing, not specific to data reference, but certainly love to brag on DAMA whenever we can. Thanks for the question.
Indeed. So I thought the term quote unquote golden record was being depreciated or falling from favor, replaced by a single source of truth.
And it depends on where you are and what literature that you're reading. They both mean, of course, the same thing. As I'm talking more and more to non-technology people, I still use the golden source piece because they understand this from the record business. Most of them are still old enough to understand what a recording was, and that you have the one source. Or you can actually do the other way if you want to go forward in future and call it the NFT version of it. But probably that'll confuse them more than anything. So I don't mind what tech or what terms that are used to do this. The real key is, can you communicate with the folks that you need to communicate to? And you are the best judge of that. I certainly cannot put words in your mouth that'll be useful there.
I love it. So can you please, there was they want a screenshot of the gender categorization slide. Can you reshare that one?
Sure.
I love it. So much good info. And of course, we'll get a copy of the slides out to everybody. And so if the business is storing all their data in non-relational database, how would reference data and master data still play a role? Does it mean reference and master data management works only with relational database and not in NoSQL databases?
What a terrific question. No, absolutely does not depend on relational technology. That said, if you understand, even in a NoSQL database, how to implement a lookup list, that can function in exactly the same way. In fact, again, getting slightly off topic here, but the key is, of course, being able to access it when it's needed to be accessed. And that access can be an HTTP or HTTPS type of an access, as well as a service, as well as a formal query, as well as any number of different things. Computers are very good at looking things up rapidly and keeping stuff in their memory. So there's an awful lot of different architectures that can be implemented in order to do that. That said, you're still going to have the situation where some things are coded, just as the gender codes that are on the screen here are coded. If I don't know what a 9 is, I will be unable to come to any conclusions based on the data that I have in order to do this. So it is still critical that we have that function. And most importantly, don't think of it as a function, think of it as a class of functions, because if you're doing it in your part of your operation, you can be absolutely certain somebody else in another part of your organization is doing something similar. Let's all devise a common way of doing this so that we have good practices around this, that we test for the right values when we're doing the lookups, et cetera, in order to do this. So look at it as a process to harmonize the practices around here as well. Again, governance is highly related to the reference and master data. It doesn't do any good to put a place for people to put golden stuff if nobody tells them to put their golden stuff in that place.
Perfect. I love it. Oh, so many great questions coming in. So confusing quote unquote customer data as part of reference data. Did I get it wrong?
So customer, okay, I think this is this slide here. Customer data, I mentioned before, the one of the hardest aspects of doing master data correctly is to coming up with a rule that says what is in fact our master data. So I showed customer data here through the example of talking about a taxonomy, and I didn't mean to imply that customer data, I should probably redo the slide, and that's probably some good feedback that somebody's gently poking me in the ribs now that I take a look at it and say, yeah, I should have come up with a better example on that. No, I would not say that customer data would be in there. I would say that the determination of the types of customer data that you're going to create and the types of allowable values that you're going to be applying to customer is there, and I should do a better job of explaining that. Hopefully that helps. That was a great subtle nudge there, and a point well taken. Thanks.
So Peter, actual case, how do you tell a CFO who is sure he has an MDM problem and seeks for technology to fix it, that he actually has a data management issue and needs to treat it holistically?
I would start by showing him the absolute abject failure rates that are around some of these initiatives and ask whether anybody would be willing to take that kind of a risk given what they know about the situation. There have been too many really poignant bad stories about master data management initiatives going wrong out there to ignore. Anybody that's buying 6 or 7 figure technology packages at this point without doing at least that much work doing the requirements for them is completely missing the prospect today. And this is not just true about master data, but the question was specifically about the CFO. So the CFO does understand one thing, hopefully very well, and that's money. So what I would develop for them is a story. And I'll give you one example that came up with an organization, is a think tank in the DC area. And there was a business executive that refused to participate in this process understanding effort. And the question that was being asked was, could a project be owned by one department, or could a project be owned by multiple departments? And if you could imagine the political implications in that, having a shared department in a think tank versus an individual department in a think tank. And again, there's nothing particular poignant about this, but just not having that information, the official in this case that they were trying to get the information said no. They finally cornered them and said, hey, we really need this. Absolutely no. Policy is such that we will not have any project can only be owned by one and only one department. And we do that as a matter of policy to make sure that somebody's accountable. But of course, then we went down to the basement and found out that the person 6 levels down, thank you, Michael Lewis, had actually coded the database such that a project could be owned by multiple departments. And in fact, it was impossible to tell at this point which departments owned which projects. We could tell which ones participated in them, but the ownership was completely unclear. So policy and technology completely separated in that instance. And the result of it was a multiple $1 million confusion that caused the organization to actually have to go back and restate its earnings estimates. Well, given that kind of a situation there, yes, I'm certain the financial VP wants to solve that problem. But if you throw in enough knowledge about what's going on in that context there to say that the issue was literally about whether a project could be owned by a thing, and that's not a decision that a DBA should have made under those circumstances, and that decision cost people time, money, and effort. So I hope that helps. Happy to chat about it offline if that's helpful, but it is really incumbent on all of us. And I think this is one of the values that Dataversity provides here, these forums for us to share these stories and take them. And that's my goal here, is to give you all some vocabulary to go off and do this. And some of you share your stories in here, which is fabulous. We all learn. So thanks for the question. Hopefully it's helpful.
So Peter, I see some of our clients still requesting data quality programs, which are different from MDM programs and initiatives, which you suggest not to go with. Would you mind elaborating why starting them independently of each other is not a recommended way to go?
I guess I would. So there's a couple different perspectives on that. Let me just go back to the DMBOK. We certainly recognize quality as different from reference and master data. But to say that there is no quality in reference, or that there's no reference in quality, is I think misguided. And I'm sorry if you got the impression that I wanted to keep them separately. No, I think most of the time that these will be more integrative activities. But if you try to integrate all 11 of these activities at once, it generally doesn't work. So I like to pick a maximum of 3. And that's why I was saying that the focus then could be a combination of reference, governance, and data quality within the same early phase of the program, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, as I showed it through. I hope that clears that up if I wasn't clear on that otherwise. Thanks for asking for clarification. No, definitely quality is going to be part of reference, and you're probably going to be doing some reference stuff. Excuse me, you're probably going to be doing some data quality stuff, and you'll realize that a master and reference data solution would help you solve your quality problems there. So yes, can go in both directions.
I love it. Do you think that a data catalog is an important tool to have in place early to enable data governance?
It's kind of a trick question. It's a good question. Thanks for asking it. When organizations, well, let's just make it very clear. The federal government passed a law in 2018 that said organizations have to make a data catalog. And so now people are trying to figure out the actual implementation of it 4 years later here, notice where we are. The government works slowly, but at least it's moving in the right direction in this case. Anyway, I also make the statement that there's never been an organization in history that's ever completed a data inventory, that you're always finding more sources. Hopefully you find fewer and fewer as time goes on. But what you're really talking about there is not the data catalog, which is the thing, it's the focus that you should have of that catalog and those cataloging efforts that provide the real value. Again, just because you have a metadata catalog, I know of a company that has, it's a financial company that has a metadata repository, but has never unwrapped the shrink plastic on it, plastic shrink wrap on it. And you say, well, what is that? And the answer is because they can respond to the following question: do you own a metadata repository, with the word yes. They never actually are asked as to whether they implement the metadata repository. So again, long way around, but the idea is, let's not think of it as a metadata thing. Let's think of it as a capability. And I'm going to tell you a very brief story here about one of my favorite companies, Nokia, who I worked with on and off for quite a long time. But Nokia, as a company, had a couple of very good goals, and were very, very good at implementing strategy throughout the organization. So one of the things they did as a company, as they were growing, this is pre-Microsoft, of course, they said, we want to play on the world stage, and the language of business is English. So therefore, all of you Finnish employees and everybody else around the world, we're going to mandate that as of a certain date, all of our conversations in our offices are conducted in English. That's a really kind of a hard thing to do for a company, particularly an international company, in order to do this. So one of the things they created was this concept called the Nokia Term Bank, NTB. And the Nokia Term Bank was just this. When they found a term that they thought would be useful for the organization, they would add it to an HTML page. And when you wanted to search the Nokia Term Bank, you went to it with a browser window and did a search for the term. And it searched through a linear piece and found a term. It was blindingly fast. More importantly, it was tremendously well accepted by the Nokians. So I remember one of my first meetings with them, I said something that was confusing, and they immediately all turned to their laptops and typed in the term that I had used into the laptop and couldn't find it in there. And then they actually had a little vote that said, do we think this term should be added to the Nokia Term Bank? And they had a process for controlling additional terms to be added to their metadata catalog here. And their metadata catalog was literally an HTML page with a definition attached to it that everybody in the entire company could access and nobody had to pay a license fee for. Now, I'm not saying that's where your metadata repository access should start, but if you had that type of capability, again, the type of things that the Nokia Term Bank was able to achieve, both in a technology sense, but also in a cultural sense. Again, watching these individuals look at this and just have it be part of their DNA to immediately reach to a source of information they knew they could easily access and gain access to. And notice I haven't said the word data once in this response. This was a business terms glossary. Of course, the data terms were added in there as well. And now you could go in and search for a specific technical or business meaning, and they started to improve upon it. I was actually hoping Microsoft might pick up on some guidance around that when they bought Nokia, but apparently that was part of the acquisition that got chomped on. Anyway, thank you for letting me babble about Nokia. It's a wonderful company and very interesting things that they've done. And I hope that's helpful on the metadata piece as well. Just you want a capability, you don't want a thing. If you have a capability, you can always update it. If you have a thing, well, that's a different component. Anyway, thanks for the question.
I love it. So I couldn't see number 15 on the slide with 15 MDM success factors. What was number 15?
Wow, I was moving too fast there. All right, let's see. I sure couldn't tell you from memory. I will be absolutely sure of that. So there we go. Whoops, that's what happened. It's got an automatic thing at the end there where it finishes. It's probably an error on my part. Okay, achieve a single view of master data. So that's your key. I wish I did know these. I'm sure these were ripped off from somebody, but I did not rip them off. They just inherited the slide. So whoever does have them, if you know who it is, let me know and we'll be sure to update it. But they're a really good set.
I love it. And again, we'll get a copy of the slides out to everybody too, so you'll have all of that. So any thoughts about how to proceed with MDM if a business has employed different cloud-hosted vendor solutions that have pieces, parts of what needs to master spread across the software as a solutions with the access to the data via APIs?
Woo-hoo.
Yeah.
And yes. So the key again is that the architecture is going to be somewhat the same regardless of the location of the actual data that's in there. Let me just go back to some of the architecture slides on this. Great question. Yeah, the cloud certainly adds a layer of complexity to things, but the cloud is not a game changer in this area. The goal here is to say, what are the systems of record, if that's what you prefer, the golden source, the single source of truth? Again, what works culturally for your organization is the key. Then can you build access? And again, that's not just an access thing, but it's access to the processes, the capabilities of an organization to say, hey, here's, again, I'll give you a terrible example, but because I've been with VCU for 29 years at this point, 30 years is my next year. It's when a student changed their name at VCU, we used to give them a list of 6 places that they had to go visit around campus to update their information. By the way, go back to your CFO example on that one. Just ask them if the customer, or much less, or maybe better still, look at your knowledge workers. Maybe they have an idea of where they have to change things in multiple places, and you can put a dollar value on that in there. The key here is that you're still going to have access to some way you say, when I'm going to go and a customer has placed an order, a good example of a master data piece, and I offer to populate that order with their shipping address and preferred charge card that they have stored with us or out of their electronic wallet or wherever it is, we've got to make sure that we know where that comes from and that we have at least good idea where that data is in terms of its maturity and its levels of quality. If I if I do it with unknown quality data, which is what most people do most of the time, I will achieve some level of mistakes in there that are probably unacceptable when you go back and measure them. So when you're looking at this in the cloud, all you're saying is, I still need to have an architectural diagram of where this database is, what are the types of accesses that I need to have to it, and how can I make sure that I deliver to it the result of this code, if that's what I'm doing in a code lookup, or the result of this combination if I'm doing a join in order to bring it forward. It's a great question. And if your cloud environment gets so complicated that it becomes difficult to do this, I would use that in and of itself as an argument to go back and simplify your cloud architecture. Too many times, the clouds are all virtually the same at this point. And the only real reason that you're going to go after different cloud technologies is because you have a focus on Microsoft Office and job data from the Microsoft perspective, retail stuff from Amazon, or if you're going to go into search and Google and YouTube, which is actually proving to be tremendously valuable out there in order to gain access to it. But multiple cloud instances at this point are clearly putting up barriers in that sense. It can be architected from, but it's also a wonderful opportunity to simplify your architecture and approach it from that perspective. Great question. Again, thank you for that.
And I love, we always get these, we've had a few already, and always get these questions, just on how to talk to leadership and others, any suggestions on how to work with company leadership that tells you that we don't need to waste time on requirements. Just go look at Gartner's MDM Magic Quadrant and pick a vendor in the leader quadrant.
Well, of course, that's one of the biggest mistakes you can make. First of all, remember the Magic Quadrant is self-funded. So if you don't pay to play in that environment, you're simply not a participant in there. But sure, I could look at the best car and, probably the best car, let's just pretend it's a Tesla today. I'm obviously driving a 20-year-old Prius at this point, or almost 20-year-old Prius. And would love a new Tesla in order to do that. But just because I want to go out and buy it doesn't mean it's the right car for me. If my requirements are for me to sit here in front of the computer and wait out the next B21A virus, whatever we're dealing with here, and I'm never driving anywhere again, it's probably not the best thing for me to buy a Tesla. So anybody that's buying technology that way, there are a couple of books perhaps that would be good for them to read. Again, a major company I was working with wanted to spend 18 billion on a particular environment. And when you go and talk to some of the other senior execs and they say 18 billion, gosh, I imagine what the sales uplift I could do if I did 18 billion towards advertising. These are questions that have to be balanced. And if there is an imprecise focus on this, by the way, Gartner will also tell you the failure rates that are associated with this. Gartner, for example, has a failure rate of data lakes at 85%. So just because something's in the Magic Quadrant doesn't mean that you can actually get a good set of values out of that as well. But you're right, it is difficult to speak with the executives, and you have to be careful about it. You've got to speak in languages that they understand. So I had somebody, again, on another call just earlier today that was a real enlightening thing. As a qual, they were getting ready to bid on a particular set of work, and they said, well, tell us about these reports that you wrote. And I was like, no, I don't really want to hear. I don't think the customer wants to hear about the reports that you wrote. What they want to hear is, what business value did the reports actually provide? And it turned out that the business value of the reports was that they used to get data on a 30-day delay process. By increasing that to a weekly report, they were able to show a 20% increase in the orders that they had in that particular area. Well, now that's a business value. Somebody will say 20% increase in orders. Yeah, I want to hear more about that. But if you tell them you made 10 reports, where's the mic drop, right, Shannon? Great question.
I wish we had that. We need that. We need some special effects for our webinars. Some visual. I love it. So, Peter, would you recommend a change control process in order to manage reference code changes, or which other processes that enables all players to realize to be aware of the change?
I don't think there is anything else but a change management process in there. It's the existence of one or not. So I don't know that you would, select a particular type. I'm not expert in that area, although there are consultants that focus specifically on the flavors of change management. But really, it's more the existence of this or not, and the idea that people understand which version of something that they're looking at. I've seen email go out around where it's up, stop working on what you're doing because it won't do anything good today. We're going to have to do it all again tomorrow. So put it all on the side of your desk and go home and start with 2 days worth of work tomorrow. Well, that's not a good way to manage a railroad, right? Or whatever it is that you're managing. So I don't know that a refinement of a change management process. I'm not knowledgeable in that area, but I do know that the existence of change management as a discipline in the organization is problematic, just the same way as project management. Again, where we've overcorrected in IT is that IT is doing a better job of managing projects well, and that is helping to improve their on-time and success rate. But at the same time, there are certain things such as data and reference and master data initiatives in particular that are programs, not projects. So people will look at and apply the discipline to installing the software, but then not the rest of the discipline to ensuring that the process is sustained, supported by organization. Imagine this again. One of the associations I like to work with when talking to executives is to say that, look, nobody's going to come to you with a serious face and say, we don't need our HR department. So the next time we do layoffs and things like that, lay off everybody in HR. I'm pretty sure everybody's hired. We got all the hirees we need to have. Everybody's going to behave themselves well. We won't need any lawyers. You won't get anywhere with that, right? They have to understand that these programs are as fundamental to the organization's success because HR isn't increasing at an increasing rate. In fact, if anything, we're having more and more trouble finding qualified candidates than, in fact, an overflow of candidates. And that's going to lead to more power on the employee's part around all this. Boy, we get really strange on some of these questions in terms of where I go with them. But that, very definitely, yes. If you can speak to them in ways that they understand the difference between a project and a program, that's probably a good layer to communicate with them. That's why they need their executive support to make sure that this program is sustainable in order to do this. You will not succeed with doing reference or master data as a project. End of statement.
I love it. I don't know why you think that. I'm surprised you do tangents or go in different directions.
And you should hear my horses whinnying in the background at the end of that, like he was commenting on my answer as well, which means it probably was terrible.
No, it's great. I love it. Well, that is all the questions that we have for today, and that is about all the time we have. So just a reminder again to everybody, I will send a follow-up email to all registrants by end of day Thursday with links to the slides, links to the recording of this session. Thanks to all of our community for being so amazing as